Hello, welcome to my talk for Teaching Beyond the Curriculum. My talk is called Feeling the Darks, Developing Information Literacy Through Multisensorial Collections-Based Learning in a Studio Art Context. My name is Beth Howe, and I teach print media, sometimes known as printmaking, at Emily Carr University of Art and Design in Vancouver, British Columbia in Canada. Vancouver is a city that was built by settlers on Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish territory without treaty or agreement. This is unceded land. Indigenization is very important to our institution, and that context really informs our teaching and learning here. Only about 5% of our student body of 2,000 undergraduates and graduate students are Indigenous, but about 25% of our student body is international. So this student body is very diverse in background, has really different experiences around arts and culture, and they come together in this place, and we often are working to make things and make meaning together. One thing I do find that the student body really does share is a really keen interest in active, hands-on, studio-based learning in art and design. So in the context of this particular conference, the question I really wanted to address is how can I, as a studio-based instructor, make studio and collections-based learning feel more connected for this cohort of students who are studio-based artists? How can I make this group of people who are very hands-on have a connection to things that are sometimes felt to be at a remove, like in a museum type collection? And then could I borrow techniques from other types of teaching models developed for other kinds of collections-based teaching, and specifically possibly anthropological collections? So my context is this, that I am a studio art instructor for the most part, and I teach primarily in the Printmaking Studio program at Emily Carr. We offer curriculum from the foundation level all the way through graduate level studies, and in our curriculum, students are typically engaging with the work through hands-on, very project-based, very experiential learning. They're making things. But another resource that we have at our institution is the WASC Print Collection, which is a collection of over 600 historic prints that's stewarded by the University Library and Archives. Students typically engage with this resource through a more distant visual analysis and secondary source interpretation, to the extent that they engage in it at all. A part of one of my agendas is bringing these two things, which seem like they really should go together, more in concert, and that they shouldn't feel quite as distant from each other for these studio-based learners. So this is what my classroom looks like. Just for a context, printmaking is it's based out of a series of production models for making things that are prints. So the words you might be familiar with are things like lithography, etchings, engravings, letterpress printing, book binding, monoprinting. These are some of the different processes that we're set up to teach, and we have excellent production facilities in order to do so. We have about 350 to 380 students moving through these production spaces each year, academic year, making projects at the direction of their instructors and also on their own independent projects as well. The instruction in these spaces is very much rooted in the physical and critical engagement with process and materials and the really gnarly concerns of making. If printmaking is a space and a practice that tends to be quite collaborative and quite collective in nature, and it is also intrinsically multiple. Most of the processes that we're using in this artistic discipline were developed in order to make more than one of something for distribution. So students are developing their image making and meaning making capacities from within printmaking's material context of production and distribution and sharing. So the print collection that we have can often feel a bit different for students, a little bit more off limits, a little more museum-like. Printmaking, while it is a really fabulous area of practice, is not often well represented in commercial or even public galleries or community spaces, so it's hard as an instructor to really contextualize students to what a print is, what it has been, and what it could be. So having this collection on site of over 600 original prints is a really fantastic resource for me as an instructor. The prints range in age from the 1500s up to the late 1900s, and it was gifted to the university by Dr. Josef Wask, with the hope that it would act as a teaching collection. That's the term that was used when it was gifted. So it's housed in this beautiful archives room, and all the prints are stored in flat files or in acid-free boxes. And it's behind a door, so students can't access it unless they have someone to shepherd them into there. This makes it a bit less accessible than the hands-on instruction that's happening upstairs in the studio space. But this is the space that we use to teach from. We can bring the prints out of that back room into this really wonderful study room that's in the library. It also shares space with the artist book collection that we have at Emily Carr. So those books on the shelves in the image on the left are all artist books. And we can bring the prints out from behind the locked door and put them on the tables to share with students. So this, to me, is huge as an instructor within this discipline, because there's an enormous difference between showing slides of print works. I'm showing you slides that become images, flat images, and showing actual prints in the study room. When we're together with that print in a room, it goes from being just a image to being an object, and the materiality and the objecthood of the print really comes to the fore in this kind of context. So the question I am asking myself all the time is, how can I teach with this studio and this collection in a way that feels integrated, like they're working with the same media and we're having the same discussions, and both places are a place for research and development of ideas. So this particular quote by Johanna Trucker, who is an artist, a scholar, and a writer, caught my attention quite a number of years ago, and it seems really salient when it comes to teaching from collections. So the quote goes as follows: "When materiality is evacuated from an image, it becomes hostage to positivist interpretations that maintain complete identity between the image and its referent." So this really struck true to me as a printmaker, because prints are often two-dimensional and they're thought of and addressed often in scholarship primarily as image. But even if you look at the image on the left of someone holding a print, you can see its objecthood there, and the materiality is really central to the context and meaning making of that work. In particular, that work is held in our collection. It's from a portfolio of photogravures that were made in the 1980s from negatives shot in the early 20th century by Paul Strand. So there was a choice made by the artist and the publishers to choose that scale, that weight of paper, and that really finicky process. And that's not to me as an artist, and I don't think to the artist who was making this work, I don't think that's incidental. So when you are handling that work, you can feel the softness and thickness of the paper, and you can really see the way in which photogravure creates really rich darks. And that seems like it's probably important to the photographer. And along those same lines, the title of this talk called Feeling the Darks. That actually comes from a current graduate student at Emily Carr, Kai Liu, who was describing making collagraph intaglio plates for his own studio practice. And this is a very particular kind of intaglio printing where you're pasting down textiles or other things with texture to your printing plate that are going to be covered with ink, and that ink will transfer to the paper when you run it through the press. So different kinds of textiles or textures hold ink more or less. That's a very quick summation. But Kai is, in this context, was talking about building up his familiarity with that printmaking process. And he's gotten to that point where he can imagine visually what the darks are going to look like from the collagraph plate by touching it. So the rougher textures will translate into darker tonal values on a collagraph plate once you've printed it. You can't see that when you just look at the collagraph plate, but you can feel it. It's a very material-based sensibility that is something that can be translated through the imagination into a visual outcome. So this idea, or this reality of the two people are just spoken about, really seems to me to be well described by the materiological imagination. So this is where we come to the anthropological collections-based approach. That terminology comes from this paper called Decolonizing Collections-Based Learning, Experiential Observation as Interdisciplinary Framework for Object Study. So this is a paper written by Christina Hodge in 2018. And here's some small points or large important points from a really interesting paper. Material literacy, Hodge writes, is the ability to approach material culture as a generative source for meaning making. The materiological imagination is a material literacy that is simultaneously critical and creative. So when I hear that and I listen to what Joanna Drucker has said and what Kai was saying about his collagraph prints, that seems to me really essentially describing what's happening there. It's simultaneously critical and creative, and the materiality is really central to both of those outcomes. So Hodge does note, and this came to make my decision to work with her model come really more to the fore for me. She knows that there is a hazard in taking this visual and material property-based approach because it can tend to privilege this viewer's standpoint over those of the makers, the users, and descendant communities. Meaning just because you can feel it doesn't mean you know it. Kind of, that's sort of my takeaway. And I was feeling quite concerned about that as well in terms of some of the content that's in some of the prints and how it's collected. And at the same time that our collections holdings are largely European, they're largely American, they're largely by male creators. My student body is largely none of those things. And we're an institution that is really striving to decolonize our curriculum. So this is something I really want to figure out how to teach with, and I was glad to have this model to test a way to work with this particular collection. So now we're getting to the nitty-gritty of how Hodge proposes to walk students through a collection and through collection items by starting with multisensorial observation. So I'm going, what if I take Hodge's approach and apply it to an art collection with a group of studio artists? So now I'm using like straight up Hodge's language here on the right, the step 1, 2, and 3. The first step will be to use experiential observation when encountering an item, an object in the collection. So in this case, we'll employ all available senses to systematically attend to and describe the material qualities of a study object. The second step will be the synesthetic analysis. So using that multisensorial observations gathered during step 1, touching, feeling, smelling, the print, we'll use those to explicate a study object's possible affordances, meanings, and significances, as well as the possible intentions of its creators and users in the past and present, bearing always in mind one's own subjectivity. And then the third part, the polysemous interpretation, is drawing on analytical insights about the study object to suggest plausible explanations for observed qualities or deduced meanings and significances, considering multiple contextualizing sources and standpoints, in particular from those makers and source communities. So some of this is very like specific to how anthropological collections have been collected and what their kind of missions have been in the past and how they might be changing now. I modified that for this very particular context where I have printmaking students looking at prints in an art collection that was gifted to us by Dr. Josef Wask. So what I did was have the class of students broken down into small groups, and I gave them either one print, or usually kind of a set of prints to work with and a worksheet to fill in as they looked at the prints and discuss them together. So the very first part was put away your phones. There's no other information coming in, only you're coming in through your own senses. So what is your own body revealing to you about this object, about its size relative to your own body, its texture, its smell, its weight, the noises it makes? And I modeled looking at a print for them to begin with so that they kind of break that barrier of don't touch that we're so schooled in, and showed how to handle things capably and carefully, but to get information like, is this paper stiff or soft? Is it thin or thick? If you smell it, can you get a whiff of the oil-based ink, or is it maybe a plant-based pigment? What kind of printmaking process do they, as printmaking students, guess they're working with here? And what would be some of the material clues that might suggest that? So do they see like mark making from certain kinds of carving tools that they've worked with? What can they see there that might indicate the how of the process? And then just describe any other material things that are happening with the print that might sort of give an indication of the life it's led. So for example, in this image, students are looking at, on the left, there's a book form. It's a book of prints by multiple Japanese artists from the Edo period. And the students did notice that the corners were really smudgy. So there's kind of like right on the bottom corners where you might be flipping the pages, there's evidence of use. The next part, the synesthetic analysis, is then to take all that information that they've kind of gathered from the material senses and start to sort of posit some kind of meaning for this object in this print. So when and where might they think it is made, and what clues might signal time and place within the print? So now you might be looking at the image itself or at the printmaking processes. If you're familiar with the history of the technology of print development, you might be like, oh, this kind of looks like a plate lithography, so it's probably late mid 20th century or something. But for most students, that's getting pretty in the weeds, but you might be able to tell from maybe the way the people are dressed in the image or something like that. Can you guess who made it, and how specifically does the print show you that? So is there a signature, for example? Is there a year written on it? So something about the medium of print is that there's a coming around the late 20th century, there's a formality of signing and numbering your prints in a limited edition. So you can get a lot of information from what's written on the print. Sometimes it's on the back, sometimes it's in the bottom edge. So you're looking around at this piece of paper with artwork on it, looking for all this other kind of peripheral information that will tell you more about this print's life. Then start speculating, why do you guess this print was made? And importantly, start listing all the questions that come up as you're looking at the print and not looking at your phone and talking to each other. Write those down. There'll be all these questions that arise that from looking at the image itself and looking at the object that you just don't have answers to and you can't answer. But those are going to be the research questions. So in this case, there's language on this print, homage to Jean Debs. And the student's like, who is Jean Debs? That's a good starting point for the next level of investigation, which would be the polysemous interpretation. So in this particular example, where I'm working with this one particular class of intermediate printmakers, I just had each student research one or two of the questions that their print asked them. And they went off and found 2 or 3 secondary sources to support that research, and then came back, and the group presented to the rest of the class their print, the things they noticed about it materially, what they guessed at, and then what their secondary research told them. Who was Eugene Debs anyways? Those kinds of things. So after doing that a couple times with a couple classes, I've kind of found that there was a really useful format, but there was some other things I needed to do to develop meaningful follow-up research beyond what her experiential framework offered, which is a great starting point. There was something that Hodge mentioned in the paper also, how crucial it is to have a discussion-based instruction around the ethics of collection and privileged interpretation. This is maybe for another presentation, but that is another kind of set of approaches that maybe set up coming to a collection, depending on the nature of the collection, how it was built, over what period of time, who built it, what was the context for it. Are these objects in the collection by the choice of the makers or not? Those are important things to be discussing in relation to any collection. And our collection, while small by many scales, still has works in it that really, as a group, we needed to discuss and think about, like, how should we go about working with this group of images? The other thing that was really crucial to have, and I was really lucky to always have, is a research and collections librarian on hand during the session that then guides the students towards the secondary sources. After their phone can come back into play and they can start asking questions, having someone with that kind of access and understanding of good resources for secondary sources, especially for something like printmaking, which is not easy to find background resources on. It doesn't have quite the same presence as other artistic medium in the scholarly research. So having the librarian on hand, absolutely completely worth it for building out more meaningful research by the students. And then the last two things, which I'll give you some more images around, I found there was just more support was needed in identifying what those material clues that the students were finding, what that even indicated. So they could start to notice these material aspects, like this kind of way of color laying down, or it feels bumpy and this kind of thing, but not knowing how to interpret that. So if they have me or another printmaking instructor with them, we can be like, oh yeah, that's because it's a lithograph, or that's because it's a screen print. That's why it feels like or looks like that, and explain the process. But if you don't have someone like that on hand, that's sort of a gap, which is hard to bridge towards the next level of research. And then because, again, we're in a studio art context, like, how do you bring all of this back into the studio? Like, how does this come back full circle to become more meaningful to those who are developing their own artistic practice? So this is the tool that Julia and I created to help with that transition between like looking at and finding material indications on a print and trying to understand what that means in terms of what kind of print it is. So this tool is called What Kind of Print Is That? And it's a online resource that if you are in the print collection or wherever you are right now and you put your phone at that QR code, it'll bring you to this resource that it will show you a list of, is it an engraving, is it a lithograph, is it a screen print. If you click onto one of those pages, there's just a very simple description of the printmaking process we're talking about, whether it's an engraving, an image from a print in our collection with little hotspots on it that when you click on them will give you some indications of material clues that if you see like very tight parallel lines, it's probably an engraving because of the particular Buren tool that's used to make engravings. So each of those different processes, there's just like maybe 3 to 5 hot tips that you're looking at, that probably that kind of print just as a starting point. And it was without being too deep into the weeds of different kinds of printmaking processes that can get really technical, just some like quick clues. Unfortunately, I couldn't live share that and record on PowerPoint at the same time. Head to the QR code and you can try it for yourself. Find out what print that is that you have in front of you right now. So the last thing is bringing it all back to the studio. Again, I'm working with studio artists, people who are really engaged with hands-on, actively like learning and understanding their world through the manipulation of materials and processes. So here's an example of a student in my introductory screen printing class who made a work. This is a self-directed choice. I don't force people to respond to the collection, though. Sometimes I think about it. In this case, Stuart did get inspired by this calendar of screen prints from 1971, 1972 that was produced in West Germany, and was a large but limited edition of commissioned works by artists that were then produced by this publisher. And I think they produced this calendar for decades, meaning soliciting artists to make designs for their work. So Stuart tried his own hand at making a screen printed calendar, and this was for me a very useful instruction in like how the material process and generates conversation about the context in which those things are made. It is really hard to print big colored flats, drop out text, and really tightly aligned color palettes and color shapes. He has an introductory screen printer, and Stuart nailed it. But in the process of finding out how hard it is to actually do, we had the conversations about, well, why, how did they do that? And then, well, what was the context of the maker? The artists weren't actually making it. There was a publisher making it. They have this print shop that's making it. They're using different inks and different materials than you. They're making it for like a semi-commercial or even commercial outcome. We can start talking about the context and framing of this work that's in the collection. How did it live? What was its purpose in the world when it was made in 1972, and how did it get there? The last bit of bringing it back to the studio is more like bringing the studio back down to the collection. Julia, the MDes student who was working with me, really wanted to try her hands at typesetting lead type, having done a lot of typesetting digitally. So we made some signage for the WASC print collection itself using our letterpress studios, our lead type, and our Vandercook proof presses, and made a lovely little broadside on heavyweight paper. We were then able to post that little broadside up in the study room itself next to the cases in the wall where we display prints from the collection itself. So in the end, what was the value, in a sense, of being able to feel the darks, as it were? What is my overall takeaway as an instructor? I found Hodge's teaching model actually a very useful way to engage with objects in an art collection, though it was designed for objects in an anthropological collection, because using our senses first allowed us to pick up on important material clues about the process, the manufacture, and the lives lived of these print works. And then those material clues generated genuine research questions around who made the work, why they made it, how they made it, what was the context for manufacture, like was this a great big production and one artist working alone? For whom were they making these works? Why were they making so many? It's because prints are often made in multiple. Why were these historical artworks made, and what was their overall context? That emerged from experiential observations. So that discussion and research into the visual reference and the content and the social context did arise, even though we began without any of that contextualizing information, which is typically where we start when introducing students to objects in a collection. So this very senses-forward approach to historical print works, I think, aligns very well with a studio art learning environment. Students are already well seated with the materiological imagination that Hodges mentions, and they're really ready to grow with it. So they can apply it into this context of a collection, something that is typically understood to be sort of like behind closed doors, sealed off, untouchable, and see how that integrates really closely to what they're doing as they develop their own studio practices. Thanks for listening. Again, I'm Beth Howe, and enjoy the rest of the conference.